you, Kelsey, for being here with us on the podcast. And I'm super excited to dive into your open source journey and experiences that you had throughout the years. But before we go there, I would like to learn a bit about your background to understand a little bit where you're coming from. Can you share a little bit about, your tech background and also what do you do now?
Man, the background. I feel like I tell this story a lot and I always get to self-reflect every time you think about it and every time you tell it. And look, I think a lot of people, you just find your way into tech the way you find your way into tech. For me, it was deciding not to go to college, buying an A+ certification, and just approaching the beginnings of my career with it's on me. If I want to take the time to learn something, I can go do that. And then every once in a while, decide that I can learn something else, which just increases the number of opportunities I've been exposed to. For 25 years, that formula has worked out magnificently well. From private enterprises, financial services, small companies, startups, and large companies like the likes of Google. And so a lot of my career has been this idea that I'm in control over a lot of it. And so for the longest time, when I first started my career, I was an entrepreneur. I looked at all those HR job postings, was like, I don't have 50 years of mainframe experience. I don't know what AIX is. I can spell it, but I've never used it before. So in 1999, 2000, that stuff was out of reach for just a normal person. At least for me, they were still shipping CDs and magazines so you can try out a Linux distribution. And so for me, a lot of that stuff was unattainable. So I started a small computer shop right in the hometown, maybe 20 minutes south of Atlanta, Jonesboro, Georgia. And I paid $1,000 a month. And I opened up this small storefront that was backed by this consultancy that did service calls for small insurance companies. But at that point, you did whatever was necessary. If someone asks, can you hook up this Xerox printer? The default answer is yes. If there's a manual, if there's someone who's ever done it before, and remember, this is kind of pre like Google search being a thing. It probably existed, but I didn't use it. And so at that point, you're really reading every page of the manual. NetBEUI versus TCP/IP, like those were the choices back then. And so you just learned to overcome and solve the problem what was in front of you. I didn't start out as a Linux system administrator. I didn't start out as a software developer. I didn't start out with those limitations. So I never thought about the things I did to be role specific. That point is important because when I do get my first W-2 job where you get a paycheck like clockwork, they take the taxes out for you, you can almost count on it showing up, and you get to just focus on a specific role. I always found that it's like the easiest thing in the world. All you want me to do is just this one job. That's it. I don't have to invoice anyone. I don't have to collect payment. I don't have to think about paying other people, just me and this task. And so during my career, I've always found it like, hey, what else can I learn? What does that role do? Shouldn't we know how to do that as well? And I think the last thing that really shapes my career is that I never accepted this concept of we just use these tools. I meet a lot of people and they will say, I use Terraform. And that's the limits of their experience. They download it, they install it, they follow the style guide, end of story. But for me, I'm the type of person that when it doesn't work, when a flag does something that I don't expect it should do, or I run into a bug, my first thought is, you should be able to fix that, right? How's it work? And back in my day, I started with like Ruby and Python. So you could literally just see the source code right there on your machine. And you would just go there and grep your way into the error message and then try to patch it in place, run it again. And if it worked, you're like, oh, that seems to work. And then I learned about this whole, you can push the changes upstream and not just keep it for yourself.
Did you ever regret not going to college?
No, because at some point you realize all that stuff is just a point in time. Like when I really sat and thought about it, if you went to college in 1970 for computer science, that doesn't make you equipped to understand the internet better than I can. You may have the foundational knowledge about how electricity works and that gets turned into packets that get sent on the wire. You may understand some CS things, but the idea of a web browser talking to a web server using Apache web server, for a lot of people, these big checkpoints are kind of like resets, right? So some people stop learning. You may have went to school in the 70s and you may have checked out for the last 30 years. Year 2000 rolls around and you're like, I don't know what this web thing's all about. I started loading tapes into some mainframe. So I think it's one of these things where, and the reason why I know this is true, Kubernetes came out when I was like 33 years old. And it was a reset for me as well. I came from Puppet, Chef, Ansible, config management. And so when Kubernetes came out, I remember just diving in. Now, one thing I think I would have benefited from going to college is like, what are these scheduling algorithms? What is bin packing? There's some core fundamental concepts that have been the same for decades. So when a lot of people saw Kubernetes as this new approach to doing things, you could just go back to a white paper by Leslie Lamport, and you would have known that there's only a few ways in the world to think about consensus and why it's important in a distributed system. I don't know if I regretted it, but I understand the value of fundamental knowledge. And so I started to make sure that I understood the fundamentals and not just the software.
I was going to say, so did you specifically hunt that out to fill out your experience and your knowledge base?
100%. I think long ago, I learned to be a historian. Like some people look at a thing and complain, it doesn't do this, versus why does it do what it currently does? And a lot of times you can go back to the mailing list. You can see people debating this decision. Should we use 128-bit encryption or should we go to 512-bit? And someone says, look, you could do that, but it's just going to thrash your CPU. And most of our customers don't have hardware acceleration. So you can make that decision for the sake of security, but the trade-off is bad for people. So we're going to default to 128. Now, look, 10 years later, it may be deemed that that is no longer a best practice, but it takes time to roll out a default flag because that's an unexpected change and make break things. So when I approach things like Kubernetes, I read the RAF paper, and that was recently written, a new take on, distributed consensus and how you would solve it. But then you go backwards and say, well, what were people doing before this? Oh, the Google folks are all about Paxos, and that was kind of complicated. And then Leslie Lamport talked about this in various ways by studying biology and how things were interacting in nature and how you could solve some of these problems or at least approach them in the time and space that you have. So I guess I learned my lesson there is like, hey, there's hardly anything that's net new, but there is a different take on things because networks get faster, CPUs get faster, storage gets faster. So bad algorithms from back in the day are now decent algorithms because you have the right trade-offs in place.